All right, we'll get started again. Good afternoon on this beautiful spring day. We have been waiting for these spring days for so long. Welcome everyone to this webinar. I hope that you can get outside after our webinar, of course. I hope that you can get outside and enjoy the beautiful weather, go for a walk, go play in the garden, whatever that might be. But this is why we live here, right? This is why we live in Minnesota for days like today. My name is Julie Tesh, and I am the president and CEO of the Center for Rural Policy and Development. I know that we have many new people on our webinar today, so I just want to very quickly share with you about the Center for Rural Policy and Development and go through our panel today. So this is the third webinar in a series that we have worked with COVID Collaborative, a national organization, on. And today we're going to be talking about, what happened with the economy, with the rural economy and the workforce. There's a lot of anecdotes out there, but what really happened here in rural Minnesota? And so today we have joining us Kelly Asche, who is our research associate from the center. And we have Luke Greiner. He is a regional analyst with DEED, which is the Department of Employment and Economic Development. Also, we have Michael Johnson, who is the county administrator in Waseca County. And Neil Linscheid, he is an educator, extension educator in community economics with the University of Minnesota Extension. And then moderating today will be Brian McClung, and he is a principal with Park Street Public. So we're really excited. The format that we're going to follow today is we will have Kelly give a report, a brief report to give you the numbers and show you how to work with the numbers. He's going to be able to show you how you can interact with the data, which is pretty cool. And then we're going to go into a panel discussion. Just wanted to let you know we do have some more reports coming out. Our fiscal year starts in July 1. So these are some of the reports that are going to be coming out here in the next 6 weeks, but then also rest of 2022 as well. So we're really excited. You can see we have a whole wide topic, a whole wide expanse of topics, whether it's childcare solutions, equity and inclusion, career and tech ed, water treatment, the whole 9 yards. So you can go to our website and check any of those out. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't let you know about our social media channels. You can check us out on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and we do have our own YouTube channel. So this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel probably at the end of the week. And so you're welcome to share that with anybody and everyone you would like. So make sure to check us out there. Also, you can sign up for our newsletter. I know a lot of you receive the invite via newsletter. So you can go to our website and there should be a pop-up that comes up and you can sign up for our newsletter there. We promise not to spam you. We send out the newsletter list, we send out the newsletter, we send out invites for the webinars, and you'll also be included in our thought leader survey. So make sure to sign up for that. A couple housekeeping things before we get going is we will utilize the chat feature today on Zoom. And so you can find that at the bottom and you can click on there. If you have any questions or comments for the panelists, please put that in there, and we have staff monitoring that chat. So please feel free to do that. And you can see here, we already have Marnie that has welcomed everyone. But please, we've had some really good discussions in the chat and really good discussions, really good questions for the panelists. So again, use that feature, but thank you again for joining us today. We're probably in the endemic phase here, I guess, of the pandemic. We don't quite know that yet, but really excited to see the data, watch the numbers come alive, and listen to our panelists. So I am going to turn it over to Kelly Asche, our research associate. Hey, Kelly.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to check this out. If you've participated or have attended these webinars in the past, you know that we do a presentation at first. This one's going to be a little different. It's actually going to be pretty short, pretty brief this time compared to some of our previous research projects that we've had webinars for. If you do have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat window. We also have the Q&A window. As Julie said, we have my colleagues are going to be taking a look at that, and they're going to be texting me if anything pops up that needs an answer. Otherwise, we'll wait until the panel gets started. The purpose of the research, and this research was released last week, was really just to start exploring and interpret newly released data from 2020 and 2021. What you typically expect at a pandemic or a significant recession, right? Like you kind of have these trend lines, and all of a sudden you hit something like a pandemic, and you're going to see some pretty significant changes in trend lines. And so that's kind of what this is all about. It's just like, what are we seeing? And the data is just starting to be released now from those years where we were in the pandemic. The data we have available so far, as Julie was saying, we put into an app. So if you go to our website, www.ruralmn.org, you'll see a research report that says COVID-19 by the numbers. And if you click on that, it'll actually take you to a different website. We kind of built just this kind of interactive tool so you could kind of look at different counties, different breakdowns of regions on different kinds of trends. So for example, we have infections. So we looked at COVID-19 cases, cumulative cases per 100,000 population. What does that look like? You know, you could look up Stevens County versus Candy, Ojai versus Hennepin and kind of take a look. What do those look like? You could even do it by economic development region or planning region. We have COVID-19 cumulative deaths. So we're starting to see kind of what that all looked like. No one's really kind of put that together to kind of say how bad was it for our most rural counties in the state versus other types of counties. We have healthcare, which really took a look at the state of some of the financial situation of our hospitals throughout the state, as well as what has gone on in terms of the number of beds available, both ICU, so intensive care unit beds that were available throughout the pandemic and how that kind of went up and down, as well as just kind of hospital beds in general and what's kind of interesting about that. We're not going to be going over those two things today, actually, infections or healthcare. We've already done some webinars on those types of things. We're really focused on this last one, economic, which is looking at jobs, wages, and employment. And there's just the data that has come out for that stuff. This is what the website, when you go to that data app, you go to our website, you'll click on it, and this will take you to this app, and you can see this is a different way. So we have COVID-19 by the numbers, that's the infections, access to healthcare, and economy and workforce. This third tab is what we're going to be going over today. And you can see, there's different tabs here on the left, so you can go down and you can go by RUCA, planning region, EDR. Some of these are by county, just kind of depending on what data is available. It's all really, really interesting if that's what floats your boat. These first set of slides, I break down by planning region. So I just wanted to give everybody a quick glimpse of what counties are involved in which planning region here. So we got Northwest, Northeast, Central here in the yellow. The 7-county metro is red, Southwest is the light blue, and orange is Southeast. So the ongoing trends that I feel like Center for Rural Policy and Development, we've been talking for quite a few years now, which is job vacancies. It's kind of like my main research thing I like to do. And this is the job vacancy rate for each of those planning regions. So this is going up from back to 2005, the job vacancy rate. And the job vacancy rate is the number of jobs available. So like jobs being advertised that are open positions as a percentage of the total jobs filled in each region. The higher that percentage, the more challenging it's going to be for an employer to try and hire someone. Because you already have a lot of jobs available, so there's more competition for the labor to fill those jobs. We consider 3% to be pretty healthy, meaning you have plenty of jobs, hopefully opportunities for people to apply for different types of jobs, lots of opportunity, while at the same time, there isn't so much that it's super competitive for an employer to try and fill those jobs. You can still try and get a pool of applicants. Again, 3% is pretty healthy. And you can see 2005, we were right around that 3%, and then that the Great Recession hit where we fell below 2% across the region. But we have recovered significantly from that, and actually most notably outside of the 7-county metro. So our most rural regions in Minnesota have seen the most significant job vacancy rate since 2012, since the recovery from the Great Recession. And as you can see here, even in 2019, 2020, when the pandemic was raging, we still had really high job vacancy rates. I think that was kind of surprising to me. You had the 7-county metro at 4%, then you had Northwest Minnesota at 5.2%. Before that, we don't have it here. These are smooth lines. They were around 7 or 8% in 2018. It was totally nuts. Now, the 2021 data isn't out, but we do have the second quarter job vacancy rate for 2021. And so I just decided I would kind of show what that looked like. And it was crazy, crazy high. So second quarter 2021, that was really when we started opening up the pandemic. From the pandemic, people started trying to hire again. And you saw job vacancy rates in Northeast close to 10%, almost 10% in Southeast, 8.3% in Northwest. These are crazy job vacancy rates, particularly for the second quarter. You know, we're talking right after the holidays when things typically slow down. So this was bonkers, and nothing we had really seen before in the past. So we took a look at change in employment. So this isn't open jobs now. This is looking at the number of jobs, the trend lines, looking at that. And these are indexes. So essentially looking at 2012, the index is 0. How has the average employment throughout the years changed? And so by 2019, you can see 7-county metro had about a 13% increase in employment since 2012. And then when the pandemic hit, we all saw these dips, right? Now, what's tough here, you could see in Northeast and Southwest Minnesota by 2021, they are about 3.5% less employment than they did in 2012, meaning there are less people, less jobs in 2021 compared to 2012. That doesn't mean there aren't jobs available, because the job vacancy rates just showed there's tons of jobs available. What this really shows is that they just don't have people to fill those jobs. So we're seeing retirements and not enough people entering the labor force in those regions to keep those numbers going. Now, what's really interesting, and I know Luke can talk a little bit about this, is we took total wages too to kind of see, all right, what's been the change in total wages? So particularly if during a recession or something bad that happens where a lot of people end up unemployed, which you'll see is a pretty significant drop in wages because it's due to an economic blip, right? Like an economic force pressing down. People aren't spending as much money. That wasn't the case here. What we saw was a pandemic forcing people, or people making the choice to leave the labor force, to just, no, I'm out. So employers, though, had demand. They had demand to sell things. They had demand to create things. And so they increased wages to try and make those jobs a little bit more attractive for people to come into the labor force. And so you could see that line, even though like in Northeast, you saw a decrease, we kind of see it recovering pretty quickly again. This would, a lot of folks in the economics would consider this a V recovery. So the trend line kind of goes a V instead of a U, where it might be a long kind of decline and then an increase. So this is really interesting. You can see in Northwest Minnesota, 43.1% total wages increase since 2012. That's really, really high. And they've only had a 3.4% increase in employment. Again, this is unusual types of trend lines. So I just want to show you a set of charts here using the RUCA county groups, which is the Minnesota State Demographer. And you can kind of see what kind of counties. We have 14 counties that are considered entirely rural, and these are based on rural urban commuting areas. So they do these calculations that essentially look at population as well as what percentage of the workforce is going to, let's say, a larger city or metropolitan area for their job. That we try and get that that kind of nice threshold of how connected are you to a metro area. Then that kind of makes you a little bit more metro or a little bit more city based. So you can see, particularly in Western Minnesota, we have a lot of the entirely rural counties, and then town rural mix actually is the largest group of counties that we have in Minnesota. We have urban town rural mix, this light brown, and then we have entirely urban. And it's important to know entirely urban isn't just a 7-county metro. It also means Blue Earth County and Clay County, and where Rochester is as well. Those counties are considered entirely urban in the RUCA county groups. So this will let us kind of figure out, does ruralness have any sort of relationship to some of these trend lines? So again, we're going to take a look at average employment and total wages. And what you can see here is our entirely urban county group, again, everybody saw this decline, but man, it really hit hard in these entirely rural areas. So since 2012, there's been a reduction in employment of about 4.5%. And it goes up pretty quickly. So if you're not entirely rural, if you have a town, particularly manufacturing, you'll see a lot in these town rural mix and urban town rural mix county groups. They're kind of holding even. So essentially they're around the same employment that they were in 2012. And again, you can see the wages here. the question is like, why would entirely rural groups see such a decline like this? Well, there's probably a couple different reasons, but I would say most significantly, and Luke can add some flesh to these bones as well. You just have an older workforce. I think a lot of folks chose early retirement or kind of bowed out of the labor force just because COVID-19 was particularly bad for folks that were 50 and older. And so that made a big difference. And that's a pretty large percentage of the workforce in our rural counties. And so that's why one of the many reasons, but probably a larger one, why we saw such a decline in employment. So another thing that we heard a lot about was that females in particular left the labor force or employment at a significant rate. And this was actually really interesting. So this is from the quarterly workforce indicators of the US Census Bureau, looking at the change in employment. So the orange is the male employment, the red is female employment. And what you'll see, again, these are index lines. So starting at 0, what do we look like? What are we looking at in 2021? So for example, in Northwest Minnesota, they had 3.1% less females in employment, female employment than they did in 2012, where they actually had a 1% larger employment among males than they did in 2012. And this was pretty common, is that we saw the female employment drop significantly more than male employment during the pandemic. So in Northeast, you'll see it's right around 1% versus a drop of 3%. 5% in Central, where there was a drop of a 0.5 percentage point in Central among female employment. And then here in Southwest, large all the way around, but largest among our female employment of 6.5%. Where that isn't the case is actually the 7-county metro and Southeast. So the 7-county metro actually, they have a 5.4% more female employment than they did in 2012 versus 2.8% in male. And in the Southeast, where there's by the end of 2021, there's 3% more female employment compared to 2012, where male, there was actually a decline, where there's 2% less in male employment. Lots of different reasons for this, but a lot of it has to do with industry makeup. You can imagine in Southeast Minnesota, where healthcare is such a significant industry, female employment is particularly a larger, females make up a larger percentage of healthcare employment. So that might have made a difference in the Southeast during the pandemic. There's a lot of different things, but that narrative around females really getting hit hard in terms of employment during the pandemic really rings true, actually much stronger outside of our metropolitan 7-county metro than it does in rural areas. So again, I did it by RUCA here too, just to kind of see what does that look like. And again, you can see entirely rural areas, female employment dropped by nearly 7%. Compared to where it was in 2012. And it kind of looks different. And then the entirely urban, they saw the increase of 6% larger female employment compared to 2012, 3.1% for males. So there was a lot of talk about remote work. So everybody's working from home, right? Deed did a study. They looked at all the job vacancies in the state, kind of the open positions, using the methodology that they use to kind of compile all those jobs. And they looked at which jobs mentioned anything about you can work from home or this is a remote work job. And it was really interesting because this was January through October 2021. The Twin Cities Metro, 13% of the job openings had that mentioned in the job posting. Northeast was 8.2. Southeast was 7.5, and then it was just this huge drop when you got to the western side of the state. So 2.4%, 2%, 2% in Southwest. So when we talk a lot about, everybody gets to work from home now, it really is pretty specific towards these certain regions. And again, that has a lot to do with industry makeup. So if a lot of your employment is in, let's say, manufacturing, yeah, there's not a lot of opportunity to work from home and have remote work. And so again, that narrative is going to be pretty specific to a couple different regions. And we'll talk a little bit about that with Luke, but as well as Neil kind of talking about, okay, 13% of the jobs available in the Twin Cities Metro is remote work. Does that mean there's migration pattern changes? And we'll talk a little bit about that in the panel. I think this is the last slide. This is just looking at local option sales taxes. So again, the pandemic really had a pretty significant impact on people's shopping behaviors. Well, things were closed for a while there. People were traveling quite a bit less. So what did that mean for local option sales tax? And for rightly so, I think a lot of counties and a lot of cities that implement the local option sales tax were pretty nervous about what that meant for their revenue trends, for transportation projects and some of the community projects that cities and counties were working on. And so we picked out just some, again, we did analysis on this. There's a report on our website all about this actual thing. And it was actually more related to the shopping, the change in behaviors of shopping online more versus shopping in person. But this actually applied during the pandemic as well. And so we pulled out a bunch of communities that kind of represent various sizes of communities in rural Minnesota, and I split it up into the different planning regions in which those communities were located. And what's interesting is if you look at everything outside of the 7-county metro, I mean, all local option sales tax is always going to be a bit of a roller coaster. But what's interesting is when we look at 2019, 2020, and even into 2021, almost all of these saw actually an uptick in local option sales tax revenues. Probably, I would say, a bit unexpected. Here's New Ulm, Fairmont. I'm from New London, Minnesota, which is the purple line here. We didn't do that great, not bad. But we went up a little bit, but we're not seeing the huge declines that I think a lot of us were very nervous about. That, boy, everybody's just going to order online, or, what's going to happen. And that wasn't the case. Where it was the case was the 7-county metro. They really got hit hard. So this is Minneapolis. And as you can see, I mean, the closure of Target Field, all the events that they host, conventions, all of that stuff not happening is such a major, revenue source for Minneapolis. To not have those really put a big dent in that. So anything around local option sales tax and anybody talking about that it really had a negative impact for cities is largely going to be concentrated in probably the 7-county metro area. Places outside of there did actually fairly well. They actually saw an uptick in most of their revenues for local option sales tax. Some reasons for that, I think it varies, but it's important to understand that people ordering online on Amazon, let's say here in New London, Amazon charges me a local option sales tax to get something shipped to my door here in New London. We have a local option sales tax. And so that's actually added on to the Amazon. So even though a lot more people might have been ordering online, those taxes were still being collected. That's just one kind of instance. I think there was also a lot more kind of like, I'm going to shop more locally. I trust it more. I don't have to travel so far. Maybe I don't want to go to, let's say, St. Cloud or the Mall of America or something like that. I think people were making different kinds of decisions based on that. So yeah, I'm going to stop it there. Again, this was a real simple, just kind of, real quick high overview of what we were seeing related to the pandemic. I really want to turn it over to Brian McClung in the panel, and we'll have a good conversation, try and put some meat on the bones, as we like to say.
Hey, great. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for that overview. Thanks to everybody for joining our webinar today. We're so glad that you're taking the time for this conversation. And I just really want to emphasize for the group how exciting and interesting this data is. In our firm, Park Street Public, we've had the opportunity to work with the COVID Collaborative over these last several months, which is a nationwide organization that's looking to bring private sector resources to the fight against COVID. I encourage you to check out their website as well if you have a chance. It's covidcollaborative.us. But through that work, we've had a chance to see what groups like the Center for Rural Policy and Development are doing in many other states. And what you have here and the information and all of this data in one place is extremely unique. In fact, I can tell you there's really nothing like what the Center for Rural Policy and Development has done in any other state. So I encourage you to go to ruralmn.org, take a look at that information and click around. I mean, where else will you find COVID data broken down by economic development region? Nowhere. This is it. So kudos to Kelly and the team at the Center for Rural Policy and Development for all of the work that they've done to do this. I want to bring in Kelly and our panelists here and have them turn on their video, and we'll jump right into the conversation. And then I'll encourage you to go into that chat button like Julie was talking about on the top of the show. and send us your questions as we go. We'll take a look at those, and Marnie and the team will take a look at those as well and highlight some for us as we go. But we want this to be very conversational and interactive. So don't be shy with your comments and feedback. This is a really important conversation and topic, and we want to hear from you and hear about your experiences and take your questions as we go. So why don't we jump right into it? I think Julie kind of gave the 5-second bio for everybody here. So if you want to learn more about us, Google their names while we're talking and then look it up that way. But we'll just jump right in because we have so much to discuss here in this session. Really want to get to it. And I kind of want to start off with a round robin with Michael and Neil and Luke in particular. And gentlemen, as you know, when you answer the question, if you could also, for the group, let them know where you're located, kind of the region or area that you're focused on, just to kind of ground everybody in what we're talking about in the different parts of the state that we're all covered here. But I want to start off and just ask you kind of the broad overview question to get it started, which is, as you look back over these last 2+ years, and you kind of think back to yourself, March of 2020, for me it was St. Patrick's Day getting shut down. I'm a little bit Irish, so that was always a shock to the system. Things are closing down on St. Patrick's Day. But as you think back to the beginning of that pandemic and where we are now in terms of the economic impacts and the economy in rural Minnesota, is there anything in particular that stands out to you or that has been different, played out differently than you thought it might have, over this period of the past 2+ years? So Luke Greiner, why don't we start off with you?
Sure, thank you. So I'm a regional analyst and I primarily cover central and southwest Minnesota, but my perspective is mostly rooted in rural counties. I do have a mix of counties that, like somebody mentioned, Chisago County, that's in my home court, and depending where you're at in Chisago County, it can seem pretty urban or entirely rural. But, something that surprised me is probably the exodus of people in the labor force all across the board. I've always talked about how slow the economy actually changes. It kind of flies in the face of a lot of headlines, and the pandemic made huge shifts in our labor force in a very short amount of time. Obviously, changes to our job situation can happen relatively quick when employers are laying people on and off and things like that. But typically people don't make decisions swiftly about whether or not they're going to retire or stay at home and watch the kids, and kind of these huge life decisions. And the past 2 years has just been an incredible shift where we've seen, in a large part, older workers leave the labor force, and rural Minnesota has a larger share of older workers. So it's a real big deal for our rural counties. And I'm going to speak in a generalization, but I would say the more rural the county, probably the bigger the issue that is.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Michael Johnson, we'll take it over to you in Waseca County, and maybe you can share with us a little bit about the work that you do there as county administrator, and share with us, anything in particular that was kind of a shock or that was different than you thought might have been as we've gone through this pandemic.
Thanks, Brian. I think we're in a lot of ways still figuring out what some of those shocks and implications are, and we probably will be for a good deal of time to come. One thing that became evidently clear to me at the local government level through COVID-19 is really the role that local government has as it compares to our state and federal partners. And we saw that a lot with the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act, and just the amount of time that really takes from an administrative level. And that was certainly burdensome for some more rural counties, perhaps, that are a little stretched in staff. I mean, I think about it within our context. I was kind of the one-stop shop for all things CARES and ARPA. And that's just the need that we had and a role that I was able to fill. But the federal government is the one allocating these funds, the state's managing them and dispersing them out, but it's the LGUs especially in rural Minnesota, that had the responsibility to take those funds and create the programs that meet community specific needs. And we saw that time and time again. You know, we've been over the necessity being the mother of invention conversation that we've all had to work through, and that define need or problem encourages those creative efforts to meet the need or solve the problem. So, you know, we can think back and look at a laundry list of ways we're able to step in and meet some problems in our community. But I certainly, starting this role with Waseca County in February 2020, did not have a grasp of anything that looked like the monolithic programs that the CARES Act and American Rescue Plan Act turned out to be.
Yeah, you got in right before the wave hit. So that's like, do your orientation and then, okay, it's none of those things. But I think, Michael, you raise a really good point, which is this pandemic really did, I think, see a reconnection of Americans to local government, because that's where these services are being delivered. That's where you are in a situation like that. You're turning to your cities, school districts, counties really become, you know, those front line of government. And I think that's an interesting thing, and maybe a topic for another webinar, is that I think our politics and our focus had become nationalized over the years, and people were always looking to Congress or the White House or Washington for kind of the problem solving and, you know, the relief. And then we found over these last couple of years, hey, it's the people that we know, it's the elected officials that are in the grocery store with us are the people that we're working with and are actually delivering on that. So I think that's a really interesting thought. So Neil Linscheid, tell us about the work, you know, from your perspective with the University of Minnesota Extension, and thinking about how all of these things come together in that setting. Anything that struck you as unique or surprising through all this?
Well, I think the whole thing was unique and surprising. I mean, it's just was so wild, and there were so many times when I was absolutely wrong about what I thought was going to happen next. I work with community leaders in Central and Southwest Minnesota. That's who I've worked with my career. So I got to see the things that they were working on throughout the pandemic, and I would say there's one thing that's been surprising to me that I was wrong about was in March of 2020, I really thought that local government revenues were in for some really big hits, like that you should be carefully watching all of your pennies and be ready for what we saw in a recession, where there was significantly less revenue for local governments. And that didn't turn out to be the case. The revenues were up in many local governments, which is surprising. And I mean, what's behind that? Consumer spending went down in March of 2020 nationally, but then it shot way up. It almost came back plus more. Our purchasing patterns across the United States, durable goods, people are buying more durable goods than they had before the pandemic. Things like recreation, you know, materials and products, things like that. It's also surprising how much more the government has spent. You know, hearing about the recovery funds, those are all big factors that I think in any normal year would be hard to understand what any one of those changes would lead to and how to anticipate what they all are. And then adding them all together, it becomes just such a messy, complicated web. I think the final thing that has been alluded to that I agree with is also the community capability. And I don't think we've had an even recovery. Not every community sort of had the collaborative capacity and the networks and relationships to respond quickly and create programs. Even before there were federal resources and state resources, there were communities that were creating their own individual programs to support businesses that were hurt. And there were also communities and places that didn't have that capability in place. And that sort of readiness seemed to really matter for how quickly you could respond and how much you could help. I guess one final thing is also to say that those vacancy rates are not the same across industries. If we look at manufacturing, the vacancy rates are lower. The wages were able to respond more quickly. to all the changes, but there's still significant vacancies in the restaurant and the accommodations industries and also the healthcare industries, where changing those wage rates is a little more difficult for those industries. They don't have demand that can help them up those wages as quickly. So that's a collection, a potpourri, if you will, of factors that I see. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Neil. Well, Kelly, I want to wrap up this round robin with you, and you've been living in the data and looking at this closely over these last several months and working on various reports and what we're seeing. And I think this kind of ties into one of the questions that we got in the chat here as well. Curious to get your thoughts about, and I think all three of our panelists talked about this a bit, in that workforce shortage was occurring prior to the pandemic, right? That was not a new problem, and especially in rural Minnesota. And then that was, exacerbated by the pandemic and this, exodus from the workforce that Luke had talked about. But how much of that is there any way to quantify that, like maybe some of that workforce exodus was occurring anyway as the baby boomers started to retire in greater numbers, and that the pandemic maybe just sped that up? And is there some sense that some of the shortage, of course, is due to people who have taken themselves out of the workforce, and some is probably due to segments of the economy booming, right? And there's growth, and then a demand for new workers that we just don't have bodies for. So maybe tell us a little bit more, Kelly, your thoughts on kind of behind the numbers on that workforce shortage, what you think we're looking at.
Yeah, sure. Well, I really like the question in the chat where it was like, was this inevitable? Was this just like a pop of the balloon that was going to pop anyway? And the answer to that is probably. The pandemic essentially just made it happen all at once. It gave everybody that was kind of near retirement age a reason to be like, yeah, I'm out. And there was plenty, I think, of government supports and helps to kind of make that happen and make that transition maybe a little bit easier to do than it would have been without the pandemic. So the short answer to that is yes. But on top of that, we also saw just major life changes that people had to make, which was, I don't have daycare anymore, or my kids are, home all the time now. Like, one of us has to stay home and deal with this while the other works, right? Like, there was just kind of this accumulation of things piling up on top. And I think what we're going to see over the next year is what kind of recovery are we going to have in terms of job vacancy rates and people kind of re-entering the labor force will give us some sort of indicator as to, all right, how much of this was inevitable and how much of this was due to total life changes that people just had to make some hard decisions, even though they're nowhere near retirement. I don't know, Luke, have you been seeing much of that data come through yet? I'd be curious from your standpoint. You see it more than I do.
Yeah, our data unfortunately lags, and typically it's just not an issue, but things have been moving fast enough. Something that I'm keeping in the back of my head, and I've kind of been talking about this for last year, but everything was just right in order to allow our workers that are 55 and older to leave. The stock market was booming, really strong labor market, people feeling comfortable, tons of, like you and Neil said, just huge amounts of stimulus to kind of support and prop up people to make these decisions. And then a public health crisis on top of it that impacted older workers more. So these dominoes were all lined up, and it really only takes one to fall and maybe pull the other one down, or maybe not. But we are seeing weakening in the stock market. Well, that's a big problem for people that maybe retired a little bit early and are dependent on their savings. The public health crisis, if you want to say it's entered an endemic mode, but people are certainly more comfortable now than they were in the past as far as COVID. And then if this brings down our labor market, if we end up in a situation where our unemployment rate maybe starts climbing slightly, or we see a decline in vacancies, it's going to take the confidence right out of people and take the wind out of that sail. And a lot of those people, like you said, that were kind of looking, that had any reason to retire, I think they're going to be the first ones back. So I am not going to go on the record and predict a recession by any means. However, we do know that our economy has ups and downs, and I think we're all surprised at how up we are considering what our economic headwinds have been the last few years. And I think it's really important to consider what happens if all we've done is kick the can down the road. Now, I don't expect like something dramatic to happen. What could be more dramatic than the pandemic? But I guess, in my opinion, the jury's still out on how well we did mitigating the huge disruption to our economy through all the policy actions we took. You know, it worked great in the short term. Will they continue working great? I don't know, but I think our older workers will tell us.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think, like, to Neil's point before about, your natural inclination was to say to local government, state government, like, hold on to every penny. You're probably going to have a big deficit coming up based on what we're seeing here. And instead, the opposite was true. And I think, I worked in the Pawlenty administration where it seemed like we had, deficit after deficit. We had kind of took office in the post 9/11, dip. And then we had the 08, Great Recession in the second term. And so that was a lot of what we were dealing with in office was that. And now this time, you have the most dramatic public health crisis in a century. And instead of seeing your revenues go down, they end up going up. Now, I think, as you're talking about, Luke, the debate will be, and we'll see if that government action, largely on the federal level, put us into, an inflationary spiral that could create a problem on the other end. And we don't know that yet. We're still seeing that play out. But of course, the stock market is kind of approaching bear market territory right now. And so we're seeing some of that uncertainty and some of those question marks happen. As you say, though, that could motivate those, early retirees to get back into the labor market, which could help stabilize things maybe. So I don't know, Neil, any more thoughts on that?
That's a great point. Just inflation alone, that is something that surprised. I mean, it shouldn't have surprised me considering the amount of things that have happened in the past year. But that wasn't part of the conversation last year. I was talking about how delicate that situation could be and what could possibly draw these older workers back, because that's, a majority of who left are workers 55 plus. But what do you do to hedge against inflation? You get more income, especially if you've decided to draw Social Security or you're on fixed income, and all of a sudden the stock market isn't necessarily producing unbelievable returns like they have the last half decade. One way to hedge against that, one way to find confidence, is start working. So I'm watching that very closely because I think inflation is, I think it's a bigger deal for retirees than people that work, because we get cost of living adjustments. You can go, I mean, I can't really because I work for the state, but a lot of people that work for private companies can go to their boss and negotiate or leverage a higher wage because we are in a tight labor market. And there's not really a place to do that if you're retired. You can't go to the Social Security Administration and say, well, thanks for the cost of living increase, I need more. So I think that's just a natural progression for older workers, is to start working at some capacity. Maybe it's very part-time, but it's a hedge against inflation.
Well, I just want to go on record, where this question started. Was this inevitable? And I'll say, yes, it was. I totally agree. And it's not going to end anytime soon. Like, if you think that these worker shortages were caused by the pandemic, you are wrong. For the past 2 decades, people from Luke's team, people like Kelly, people from the state economist, state demographer's office, have been telling everyone who could listen, who would willing to listen, that there is a labor crunch on its way, and it will be starting. And we know that it's happening because people age every day, and we can count them. And it's not even difficult math to see that. So let's say the pandemic didn't happen, and we're having this conversation, 2 years ago without the pandemic, we'd still be talking about this, and we'd still be saying, where do we need to go in every one of our communities? We're having trouble finding workforce. There's not enough people being born in Minnesota to solve that problem. And we need to find ways to attract people from other parts of the world, wherever those might be, to fill the jobs with the demand that we have for our Minnesota companies that are being successful.
Mhm. I want to dive into one of the issues that was in one of Kelly's slides. And Michael, I want to start with you on this one. I think early in the pandemic, in particular, maybe the first 6 months or so, when remote work became, an automatic for everyone who could do it, requirement if you could. I think there was a sense that people might leave the Twin Cities and move to rural Minnesota because they could do their job from anywhere. If you had that kind of job where you could work remotely, you could get, a bigger house for your dollar. You could have a better quality of life. You could enjoy the outdoor and recreational opportunities that we have in greater Minnesota. And so I'm curious, of course, then in Kelly's slide, it points out that the percentage of jobs that say that they allow for remote work tend to be more in the Twin Cities to begin with. So maybe there's a little bit of a push-pull on what's happening there. So Michael, I'm curious, in Waseca County, you might be well positioned for what we're talking about because it's rural. You can get the benefits of living in a rural community, but you're not real far from the Twin Cities or from other, markets if you want to get there. If you did see an influx of people, and I think, for the rest of you kind of more broadly, do we think that there is a possible trend where people, are able to negotiate for that remote opportunity? And could that allow for some population growth in rural Minnesota?
Thanks, Brian. We've seen that in a couple of areas. And in some ways, I'll give the caveat that we don't have new enough data yet to fully make that determination. But where we have seen it is in our most recent sales study ratio from the Department of Revenue that spanned from October of 2020 through the end of September 2021. So that's tracking the sales specific information, the who bought, who sold, where were they from, where are they going to. We have seen some of that. A relevant corollary that we've seen recently is the kind of Lake Minnetonka versus Clear Lake comparison within the city of Waseca. Can I get, and taking into consideration the housing market that we have today, and especially over the last couple of years, there certainly has, outside of just remote work, just the pecuniary benefit that people have seen of, I can sell my house here and get twice as much house for half as much cost with the same kind of effect and still be able to keep my job and do my job. And then we've seen that especially in law enforcement areas, correction officer areas. There have been a number of applicants from some of our neighbors to the north that are looking for a little bit change of scenery, perhaps, and that could have various motivations there, of course. But I'll actually be more curious to look at this question about a year from now, when we have the total of that sales study ratio from both the end of 2021 through 2022 to see how that effect really happened, because the data we have now is really looking right in the heart of the pandemic when it happened, and so we're still a little early in some of that analysis.
That's great. Neil or Luke or Kelly, do you want to jump in on the move to rural Minnesota phenomenon?
Sure, I can jump in a little bit here. So we did do a study here. My colleague Xingyi Chen and I worked with MnDOT to survey both employers and workers across Minnesota and ask them about their telecommuting policies. We did that around this time last year. We were starting that project, included some focus groups as well as the survey. And we wanted to understand policy changes because that's kind of like a harbinger of what's ahead. If your company has a telecommuting policy or developed one, it might signal that might be a possibility for the future. We also wanted to know about productivity and people's arrangements. I'll put a link to the study in the chat box. Some things that I think are interesting for that. First, we heard from people, flexibility is like the key. It's not necessarily that it needs to be telecommuting, but that flexibility with your work arrangement was a big bonus, and it's something that people are looking for. We also saw that across greater Minnesota and the Twin Cities, we didn't use the RUCA codes, but those it was more likely in greater Minnesota for people to respond that they would be telecommuting 1 day or less per week. And in the Twin Cities, that was 2 to 3 days per week. So even among this, we sometimes get into a dichotomy of saying it's all or nothing. And the reality, I think, today is that many firms that have jobs and roles that can have telecommuting are looking for some sort of balance that they can strike with in-person and telecommuting options. The other thing to really keep in mind is that on the migration, like, does this mean we'll have more people moving to our community? We've had anecdotal evidence, probably in everyone's community on this call, that there are people looking for those. And I agree with Michael, we need to wait for more data to answer that definitively. But there are limiting factors that don't mean it's automatic, right? And that's housing is one of those. Like, yeah, maybe you do have a job that you could work from home, and now you want to move outside of the metro or from one small town to another small town. It doesn't mean that there's a house available that you want and that you can purchase. So limiting factors like that, childcare, those other things, they didn't mean that it was an automatic, everyone shift this big tidal wave of people moving.
One thing I'll add too that I think is kind of interesting about the remote work job is, and this is anecdotal, but I think it's something to keep an eye on. I was talking to an employer in northern Minnesota who had a couple of spouses that they were living in the Twin Cities, wanted to move back to kind of the Central Lakes region. The employer hired both of them. And when they went back to the cities and told their employer, the employer was like, whoa, don't leave. We'll keep paying you this wage, but you can go ahead and live up there. That's fine. Well, when they told the employer up north that, the employer couldn't match that wage and was just like, yeah, I'm kind of crap out of luck now. So that's what's going to happen. So it's interesting that, when you look at particular job vacancy data that Dept puts together, in the 7-county metro, wages for the most part have been relatively flat. And the largest wage increases have actually occurred in our more rural areas where they've had job vacancy rates at a higher level for a longer period of time. So there's a little bit more that big gap that used to exist in wages for job vacancies. It has closed a little bit. But with this kind of new thing of people being able to work from home, even if though, as Neil's saying, it isn't necessarily full time, it does kind of expand the competition in which a lot of companies that live or that are stationed in a rural area, they're not competing with, 1 or 2 or 4 counties near them. Now, all of a sudden, they're competing on a much more countrywide or even global scale than ever before. And so that'll be interesting to keep an eye on as we move forward too, that even though people might be moving into rural areas, doesn't mean they're taking the jobs that we need them to take.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add to that is mainly because I really haven't seen any wild successes of rural communities trying to convince people to move to their area. I mean, I think a lot of communities try that. They market it. And I'm a small town guy, just like Kelly. All of us probably. You can pay me enough to work in the Twin Cities, but I'm an incredibly small minority, and people continue to keep moving to the Twin Cities. I think that the added ability to telework might help some of our folks in rural communities stay there. It might kind of nip that in the bud, so instead of having to move to the Twin Cities to work in a particular field for a particular company, the ability to maybe only do it once a week to have to drive there or not at all, I think could be a boon. Obviously depends on your access to broadband.
I want to touch base on, go ahead, Neil.
Oh, I was just saying, Luke, you're talking about examples, and I see Aaron in the Q&A put in the 218 relocate example. And there are other examples of, people attraction projects and programs across the state. I think we're already trying to make this play, trying to get out there in front of people and say, yes, we do have the things that you need here in this community, and we are excited to have you. And we're expecting you to come. So we're ready to welcome you when you arrive and make it easier for you to live here. I think that comes back to that community capability and capacity to pull this off there might be an opportunity for more people to be working from home from your community. Do you have the ability to capitalize on that? And also, are you thinking about how they're integrated into your community in an effective way so that they stay? We don't want a whole bunch of people to move, out to our communities and then find out that it wasn't a place they want to live and then leave. That would be worse.
Mhm. Yeah, that would be disruptive overall. I think want to ask you guys your thoughts on this question in the chat from Mike Wimmer about automation. And I think it's an interesting question, interesting thought, because it feels like before the pandemic, like that's the thing we were all thinking about, was like the robot's going to come take your job, right? Like there was this really big conversation starting up about AI and automation and how that was going to change the workforce. That all kind of got pushed to the side in the meantime, although there are a lot of industries looking for automation opportunities now to make up for this worker shortage. I'm just curious to get your thoughts about what you're seeing there and how that relates to what's happened in the pandemic.
So we don't really have anything specific to rural Minnesota on automation. So I can speak about anecdotes. I know nationally, the trends are up, and it really only makes sense that this is going to exacerbate, because with inflation, rising wages driving a lot of that due to a tight labor market. Also, the disruption of labor from the pandemic. I mean, I don't think most people in their lifetime have had to consider what happens if 50% of our workers can't come to work because they're sick or they're quarantining or their kids are home. All of a sudden, your labor became this huge variable that it never really was, at least not for 100 years probably. And I think all that's going to drive more investment in automation. I will say that my perspective is not necessarily, hide under the bed, the robots are coming. My perspective is, thankfully, the robots are here to help. You typically augment jobs. You automate the most monotonous, repetitive, dangerous things. So it allows other people's jobs to be better, higher paid, higher skilled. So it's thankfully probably going to be seen in a better light, because we're going to need it more and more. You just look at the restaurant industry. There's a sector that really has been untouched by mass amounts of automation in the customer service facing side. And now we're seeing, there's prototypes of delivery carts and things like that. And I guarantee that's going to be driven by the lack of people that they can hire, the difficulty of them hiring, the inability to keep hours because they can't hire anybody, is going to drive this technology in places that we probably didn't expect it, because it's primarily just been focused in manufacturing and to a limited capacity in healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
On this automation question, Luke, so you're saying, hey, the inflation is really driving wages, so it'll encourage people to make more capital investments into technology, right? Do I understand that right?
Yeah,
okay.
I believe so. That and just the inability to hire, and obviously I could be eating these words if we end up in some sort of downturn where there is massive unemployment, but our next downturn, we might not have massive unemployment either. And all of a sudden, if labor is freed up and we have a lot of slack in the labor market, maybe that would put off some of those investments, because automating processes is expensive. But I think more employers are looking at it as a long-term strategy to hedge against the slowing labor force growth.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. That's what I thought. Well, then I just add 2 points here to this automation conversation. One is that I think a lot of automation has been happening quietly. It's just not the big glitzy stuff, right? It's, maybe think about how your email has changed over time. It's slowly getting better at filtering out spam and giving you potential replies. So things like that are happening. And to the people that think about automation most often, they often talk about it as happening in levels of automation. So it's not that we go from a job, was a manual job, all the way to a robot is doing it. There's a lot that happens in between, and there's sequential things. So it may not. What I mean to say is that I think automation was already happening. Technology sort of has been marching on. And the thing to add, especially in the manufacturing sector, is that also has made many jobs much more attractive. Like I toured a manufacturing facility in my hometown last week, and from the outside it wouldn't look like much, but on the inside it's filled with really amazing machines, and it's a pleasant environment. It's got, they're making great products, and it's not the sort of job that maybe people have in their minds in that industry as a dirty, difficult, backbreaking job. It's using complicated computers to make high precision parts, and that might be a good thing for us, attracting more of our youth into those kind of roles in the future.
That's kind of where my mind was going as well, Neil. You already mentioned it. We've been slow dripping the reality of automation for years, and we have a company in the city of Waseca that builds custom robots and automation solutions for businesses all across the world. And part of that is insulation against some of the skills mismatch we're already talking about, and the job disruption. You could dive into this deeply and look at immigration numbers. Okay, this didn't meet certain thresholds or anticipated numbers, so where are some of these entry level jobs coming from? But we were talking about policy as well, and in a lot of ways we have pre-pandemic policy in a post-pandemic world, and we're still trying to catch up to what this should look like, because the labor market has demanded a lot higher expectations, and they don't necessarily want to do some of those jobs. So I know locally, looking at a couple of manufacturing jobs, they have not had a lower shortage or regression in labor workforce, but their only viable means of expansion in their mind is to automate some of these tasks, because they don't have the ability to just, okay, let's set up another line over here and find 25 people to do it. It's not feasible. So it's not as though they're necessarily losing staff, but the ability to replace, as was already mentioned, is much more difficult. That conversation hasn't been new, at least in the county world, for many years. We were looking at 2020 to 2030 as already being a big obstacle to overcome before COVID-19 was even a thing. We were looking at 25 to 30% of our workforce turning over in that time period, and okay, how are we going to replace these individuals? And yeah, and I think Goldman Sachs had something like a study, like 2.5 million people retired during the pandemic, and 1 million of those were considered early retirements. And we took a weird approach in that we offered an early retirement incentive right in the middle of the pandemic, anticipating some of these things happening and trying to spread out some of the pain, so to speak, that would be experienced over the next few years. So we were in a place where we can be proactive and plan and incrementally margin that out. So we tried to do it that way. But there's, of course, a number of factors that go into this, but that we were always, it isn't new information that this decade was going to be the largest regression or shrinking of the workforce that we've ever seen.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. As long as we're talking about these kinds of changes and how they impact rural communities, I want to circle back to the slide that Kelly had on local option sales taxes, and just kind of get all of you to weigh in on what you're seeing there. I mean, I think the big takeaway from that is that it wasn't as bad as we thought it was going to be, right? That in the local option sales taxes have largely recovered to pre-pandemic levels, after a bit of a dip, and then a pretty quick recovery. But not everywhere, and less so in the Twin Cities, like Kelly was talking about, Minneapolis, where their local sales tax revenue is more reliant on big events and filling up Target Field and US Bank Stadium. So Michael, maybe we'll start with you in Waseca, in the county, and what you saw relative to kind of tax revenues in general, maybe local option sales tax specifically, if you've got examples of that. And then for the rest of the panel, just kind of your thoughts about what we saw, relative to that from the pandemic and where you think we're headed.
Sure, sounds good. So I'm just going to share my screen quick, Brian, to look at a couple of specific data points. And when we talk about local option sales tax, it's a program in Waseca that started in May of 2019. So it's new for us, but the data would line up exactly with what Kelly was looking at earlier, that, you know, looking at that trend line in the middle, it's very linear progressive. It's been increasing since its inception, and in ways that we didn't expect, quite honestly. You know, the inception of this program was just prior to my time arriving here, but you know, the natural offset or the desire, I guess, was spreading the burden of what that distributable levy would be for people that are demanding those services, and then, you know, ultimately reducing that net levy impact, as you can see in that graphic down at the bottom. So in 2019, the county was budgeting $1 million for local demand for construction. That wasn't the full amount of the construction budget, but that was essentially, here's the levy supplement we need to see to maintain our road and bridge program. And lost at that point in time, it didn't exist. It didn't exist in the budget framework preparation for fiscal year 2019. But then in 2020, we're anticipating about $480,000, and you can kind of just follow that data as we go. In 2023, we're projecting $950 to up to $1 million, and you can see in actuality in the bottom left what that data actually looks like in terms of gross receipts. And again, exceeding our expectations, but not just that, continuing to grow over time. And then when the pandemic showed up, that initial dip in month one, but then just dramatic growth in subsequent months. And no, that wouldn't have been expected. So it has been very interesting to see what that does. So it is ultimately a reduction to our levy impact, which is great. We're a predominantly agricultural county, and I think Center for Rural Policy has done some analysis on that in the past in terms of the Amazon effect in general, and what that means when you're putting all of your proverbial eggs in one economical basket, so to speak, for rural counties. But just looking what this in practicality for what this looks like at the Waseca County level for our transportation improvement projects, and what's required for local option sales tax, just as a quick visual example, and then associating some of the anticipated costs for that project timeline over, you know, a decade plus in time. So it's been a big win in terms of revenue for the county, certainly an unanticipated win, but it certainly allows us to be more fluid and strategic with ultimately that levy impact and budget setting process that we've seen.
Interesting. Kelly or Neil or Luke, any thoughts on the tax implication of what's been going on here?
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, we did, so Neil, myself, and his other colleague, Brian Pesch, we did some analysis looking at local option sales tax revenues, but it was under the kind of framework of what does the rise of online sales mean in terms of what revenues, how is that going to impact revenues moving forward? Because there was this kind of, you know, before the pandemic, a lot of counties and cities were kind of worried because they would look at their main streets and be like, we're seeing these shops close up. We're seeing more and more Amazon deliveries to our neighbors' houses. This worries me. What does this mean for our tax revenues? And when we dug into it just under that framework, what we saw is that actually Amazon so far isn't having a negative impact on local option sales tax revenues, but rather a positive impact. And it's largely been due to both the Supreme Court saying, you know, telling online retailers that they have to charge sales tax and collect it and remit it to each state that has that. So that was a big change in 2018, but also the Minnesota Department of Revenue making it pretty clear on how those types of rules are going to be followed by those retailers, and really doing a good job at tracking retailers down, saying, hey, you got to do this, you got to follow the law, things like that. So even though more and more people are ordering from Amazon, what you're seeing is that those sales taxes are still going to wherever they're at in particular. Now, when it came to the pandemic, then it was kind of like this another fear, like, oh man, now like it's totally going to change the shopping behaviors. And I think both Neil and I were a little bit surprised that they did increase as much as they did. And again, this had a major impact on shopping behaviors and what people, how they were doing their shopping and where they were doing their shopping. We just kind of, I think in our heads thought, man, less and less people are going to go to these places that they usually go to that charge local option sales taxes, because they are what we call tax importers, right? So I'm pretty close to St. Cloud. So Stearns County has a local option sales tax. St. Cloud does because that's our economic center. A lot of us go there, right? But that wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, people still did some of their travel. You saw a lot more where people would be here. I'll order on Walmart.com, but I'll still go to, let's say, Wilmer and pick it up. Well, that sales tax still gets charged then if you picked it up in Wilmer. So there was all this kind of nuance that really played in favor of like a lot of the local communities doing well and seeing an uptick in their revenues, both in terms of people wanting to shop maybe a little bit more locally, and then the behavior's not changing all that much. But I don't know, Neil, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you, Kelly, because we wrote that paper together. So that's why I agree. But I'll just add a little nuance to it. So thinking about the pandemic, we also saw enormous ingenuity and adaptability from local businesses. I mean, and that's a capability that I think is going to go forward. Prior to this, I spent a long time trying to help small business owners get online, and sometimes it was difficult to see the payoff for setting up an online ordering system, for instance, getting regular on Facebook during the pandemic, and particularly when there were business closures. A lot of people got on board really quickly, and now that it's better. You can order online from small town restaurants easier than you have ever been. Pickup is like available from really great restaurants all over greater Minnesota. A lot of retailers, they're putting their things that maybe they didn't have online on Facebook more frequently. They've dusted out their websites, and they're embracing using the internet as a tool. And I think some of that was just driven by having to rip the Band-Aid off during the pandemic and deal with this and figure it out. And a lot of places did.
We had a couple of questions in the chat that related to childcare, and Kelly talked about that in his opening presentation, and so I want to have all of you weigh in on the role that childcare plays in all of this. And in part, that was Kelly's numbers showing that the decrease in unemployment for women was greater, than men, and in part maybe because they're a primary caretaker in some cases. And so we know that there was already a childcare shortage in greater Minnesota. It's something that the Center for Rural Policy and Development has been looking into for a long time. And I think, I'll get these numbers wrong, Kelly, you can correct me, but it's something like during the pandemic, Minnesota lost like 3,500 seats in childcare, and something like 2,000 or 2,500 of those were in greater Minnesota. So a disproportionate number of the share of lost childcare openings were in greater Minnesota, which has less population than the metro area. So I'm curious to get your thoughts about what we saw relative to childcare in the pandemic, and is there a path forward to get out of that, or are there solutions, are there ideas that are beginning to emerge? We've done some work with childcare groups, and they refer to themselves as the workforce behind the workforce. You can't have that full workforce without the workforce of childcare. So curious to get your thoughts on what we're seeing there. Kelly, do you want to start and correct my numbers, or Luke, go right ahead?
No, go ahead, Luke. No, your numbers were spot on. Luke, go ahead.
Kelly and I think Neil and me and pretty much everybody that has a conversation with me, childcare becomes an issue just because it is so widespread and it's so far reaching in its implications. And we know that it was challenging on all families, the pandemic. And then you had this instability of care, of centers or in-home services being quarantined and closed down. And it really pushed employers to accommodate. Like there was nothing employers could do but accommodate these sort of flexible demands from their staff due to childcare and even school closures for that matter. And I think that might be one of the best ways forward that I can see. I mean, I don't know how we get more childcare in rural Minnesota. Like, we certainly need that. But one way to get more care from what we have is to make it more efficient. And on the employer side of that means that opening up that flexibility. And I've talked to employers before, or wives, I should say, who don't actually think that they could have worked in their current position under their current like leave policies and absentee policies and things like that. All these barriers that we've set up for caring for our kids in the employment land has been able to basically fly because we haven't had this tight of labor market. And then we also haven't had this dramatic of a shift in acceptance of flexible floating shifting schedules, remote work, things like that. All those types of things that we got out of the pandemic, I think, are going to be a benefit for our workers to help moms and dads that are caring for kids hold down jobs without, pulling out their hair and trying to figure out what they're going to do every single day. And my hope, at least, is that employers recognize the benefits of that flexibility that they've had to do during the pandemic and carry that forward into the future. Just because that's one way to keep this moving instead of having to quit. Maybe just allow a gliding schedule or something like that. Employers are obviously much more open to that now.
Yeah, anything you're seeing on childcare, Kelly or Michael?
Well, I was going to say, just to kind of give people an idea what those numbers look like. So I'm going to use Initiative Foundation regions. So I think everybody's pretty familiar with that. If we look at the Southern Initiative Foundation region, I'm looking at the numbers here. So a lot of folks have been really kind of pushing the center-based care as one of the ways in which we try to, if we can increase that in rural areas, we can make up some of this gap. Between 2019 and 2020, the change in center-based childcare capacity increased by 464 slots in that Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation. The unfortunate aspect, though, is that the family-based care, they lost 777 slots. And so, one of the things is there a way to kind of plug that hole of family-based care while we're also increasing center-based care to try and make this switch happen a little bit faster? I don't know the answer to that. I know a lot of initiative foundations, a lot of nonprofits and organizations and counties are starting to get super creative and trying to figure out how to support and get more childcare into more childcare capacity into their regions. But one thing I just saw in the chat too that I wanted to bring up that I think will get more attention over the next few years is the increasing role that workers are playing in taking care of their elderly parents, kind of care, elderly care, that I think we're going to see a lot more of as we move forward. And I think that's something that I haven't seen any research on it. I haven't seen any numbers on it yet, but I'm hearing more and more murmurings about it. So that'll be interesting.
There you go, Kelly. That's a new research topic for the list.
Yeah. I'll tell Deed, you guys do it.
Exactly. Hand it off to Deed. Michael, you have thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so we are one of those counties that has been working with Smith quite a bit over the last several months, and the estimates that we put together, even in a smaller rural county, we're still 450 plus units short when we just look at that age demographic from 0 to 4, compare our center capacities and our family-based capacities. We're well short, and we know that, and we hear about that from each of our cities. So we've really been trying to figure out what is the county's role in this for months now. Are we a fiscal partner in this? Are we a strategic partner in this? What should our role really be? And it's not something that we've had to address before this time, it seems. The pandemic certainly hampered the family-based services. We've met with local providers. We've asked for feedback. We've met with businesses trying to get creative, as Kelly was saying. Hey, if we start this center, what are you going to invest in from a business standpoint? We want you to buy 5 to 10 slots for your employees and help support this community initiative or venture. So we have a model, we have a space, but the thing we did get involved in is, okay, we have some empty buildings. We have some dark store that we're battling. So how do we take existing spaces that are somewhat dilapidated and run down and don't have really an existing use for? How do we convert some of these into a place that solves a big need that we have? So that's something we're working towards right now. We have a location and a model and a plan, and are now trying to figure out the practical components of, is this a nonprofit initiative? Is this a county-based initiative, a city-based initiative, a school district initiative? So we've gone through a lot of stakeholder analysis recently on that, and are fortunately continuing to move forward with it. But it's been interesting to hear the perspective that the pandemic did have, or the impact the pandemic did have on our family-based providers. So part of the solution is more of a hybrid model. It's a center, but it's also a pod system where people that have an interesting, the family-based services, the individuals that have a desire to provide that service, just not within the confines of their own home, or don't have the infrastructure to do it within their own home, can lease out or rent out a space, utilize a space in this overall center, but for their specific clientele, for their specific families. So we're excited to see where that continues to go.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I think that's a great model. And like Kelly McDonough mentions in here too, the idea of maybe intergenerational or retired people there. And I know I've seen some childcare sites in the Twin Cities that have sprung up next to places where older adults are living, right? Where it's a 55 plus housing community, and then a childcare. And so you kind of mix in the retired grandparents can have part-time jobs, help out. It helps out because that'll be the big next challenge, of course, we finding people to work there. So that'll be very interesting. Well, I think as we're approaching the end of our time here, and this has been a great conversation, I just kind of want to give you all the chance to kind of give us some of your closing thoughts. And in particular, what are some lessons learned out of this pandemic? I mean, we've talked a lot today about how different it was than we thought it might have been, and how it has impacted the economy and workforce and childcare and so many different aspects of what we're tackling in our community. So kind of as we wrap up, I'm interested to get your thoughts about any other lessons learned coming out of this phase of the pandemic and entering into this kind of different part of what we're dealing with. And in particular, thinking about from that economic perspective, what have we learned that we can apply in our communities? What are some of these creative ideas and approaches that are going to help us get through these challenges? And what are you, when somebody says, what do you recommend to us, or what should we be thinking about as we continue to, to recover and grow through this period? Interested in getting your thoughts. So I don't know, Neil, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I'll come back to capability of our communities and also the people that live there. And just to what's the lesson for? Well, we don't know what the next economic shock or challenge will be. But I think the features of being able to collaborate, being able to work across both business, nonprofit, and government sectors to find solutions to whatever's in front of you. We saw places doing that, and they came up with amazing things that really worked. And you should keep the pedal all the way down to the floor on that sort of thing. You will never look back and say, I wish we could collaborate less. I wish we knew how to work together less. It's just, that's the lesson. And the other capability to keep in mind is just that in 10 years, we're going to have a generation of kids, and well, sooner, that know how to learn, communicate, and engage with people through the internet. And how many kids had virtual school? That's an incredible change in all of our lives, and as well as us being on these sorts of things. And I think we have to keep, although we might find fatigue, keep asking ourselves, well, how can we use these newfound capabilities, like collaborating, like working together online, like just being innovative about what we're doing, and taking risks in how we do things, the way we do things. Those will be lessons that we should keep doing. It's easy. It's an easy one.
That's great. Luke, do you want to go next here?
Sure. I guess I'm perpetually optimistic, even though most of my presentations can end up really dark and depressing. I usually try to do it with a smile on my face, at least. So I'm looking at this kind of the next steps. What can we leverage? I think a lot of those necessities that came out of the pandemic are huge benefits with or without a pandemic moving forward. The ability, we know that women are primary caretakers of children and aging adults. Think about the benefit they have to access the global labor market through telework. And does your community allow them to? Do they have access to broadband? If they don't, we're kind of shutting them out. But at the very least, not letting them access what they might be able to contribute, which is one of our problems, with a really slow growing labor force. Same thing with childcare. The other part of that, kind of what Neil had mentioned, made me think of it. It's a concern, and I hate that I'm going on a concern, but we know that distance learning didn't work out real well for a lot of kids. That's pretty well established that has mostly been a failure, and the kids that need the most help ended up the worst off. And I can't do anything about that, but one thing that I do think of is, do the same children that struggle, those students that struggle with distance learning in school, are they going to struggle with remote work? So as much as I am optimistic for remote work's future, I know that it's not for everybody, and there's certainly going to be those challenges. It can't cure everything, but I think it would be foolish to forget all the flexibility and all that we've been able to accomplish through teleworking the last few years, and then basically wash our hands of it and say that was just a temporary phenomenon out of the pandemic, and it has no application in a post-pandemic world.
Great. Hey, Michael, do you want to go?
Absolutely. Yeah, great comments, gentlemen, and I would certainly reflect on those as well. Something we've held discussions on with my leadership team several times is not being quick to revert back to past normalcies. And exactly like these other guys were saying, embracing the positive impacts. We talk about impact of COVID-19 in our mind. I'm glad you're more positive, Luke. I tend to probably be on the opposite side of the spectrum, where I think about the worst case scenario first and then work backwards from that. But we think of that with the word critique as well, and all a critique really it is a detailed analysis. Doesn't have to be a negative connotation just because our mind likes to go there. And there, from an organizational standpoint, there were tremendous takeaways and benefits from COVID-19 that we never would have had, or at least not in a very timely manner, but for its existence. Telework, yes, that's one of them. And we didn't have a telework policy until July of 2020, and for a lot of our long-term department heads, it was a 4-letter word. And we did a lot of growth and learning there, certainly. And we've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars pushing more of our services to an online presence, and making sure services didn't regress just because people couldn't physically come to us for them. So continuing to proliferate those ideologies and those innovations that have happened as a result and out of necessity, continuing to build upon that new framework and not trying to revert back to a previous framework because it was more comfortable or more identifiable in some way. So, we've kind of adopted that Winston Churchill-like mindset of never letting a good crisis go to waste. And I think we all have to embrace that mentality. We might not agree with everything he's going to say, but when, during moments of crisis is essentially when we have to question the normalcy and what the accepted reality is, because things are obviously going wrong or have gone awry. So we're having to find immediate answers still, and having to think outside of the box or outside of our usual compass to come to those conclusions. So just continuing down the same path that's been put before us, even if we didn't ask for it, but taking the positive takeaways and just keep moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you. Kelly, you get the last word. We started with all of your wisdom and insights, and we get to wrap it up here. So toss it over.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll just say, I'll say a couple things. First of all, I hope people really understand the dramatic situation that we just kind of went through. It was huge. It was significant. It was very unique. And the fact that we're all able to kind of circle back around that so far our budgets are okay. Our economy didn't crash. We're not seeing anything super duper bad in terms of outside of losing loved ones and the healthcare side of things. I hope at some point everybody can take a moment, take a breath, pat ourselves on the back and say, hey, we did all right. Like, we're doing okay. I think that was kind of like the one big surprising thing when I went through all of this data is that, yeah, we saw some pretty significant trends happen, but for the most part, we're doing okay. And I think that's important to, I don't know, reflect on a little bit as we continue to move forward, continue to see the repercussions of all of this, and continue to react in a very kind of reasonable way. So that's kind of how I'll leave it is, hey, we're here, we're doing okay, we're gonna make it.
We made it. We're still talking, and we're learning lessons. So, well, thank you to our fantastic panel, Michael, Neil, Luke, and Kelly for putting together this research and great information. Again, we encourage you to check it out, ruralmn.org. Thank you so much to all of the people that have taken an hour and a half with us this afternoon to talk through this. Really appreciate it. It's important to have these conversations and keep reflecting and sharing. There's always more information on the center's website. And like Julie mentioned at the beginning, this has been recorded and will be posted on the center's YouTube page. So we encourage you, if you liked this, once it's up and you get that email that it's up, forward it to everybody that you know and let them know that they can tune in and watch this themselves and enjoy it as well. So with that, we'll conclude today's program. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and hope to see you again on one of these very soon. Take care.